You did everything right. You studied, you sacrificed, you won the global lottery, and you're still losing. June 2023, Lagos. The air is thick. The generator hums below your apartment balcony. You're 32 years old, a software engineer. You work remotely for a European tech firm. Your salary arrives in euros. On paper, you've cracked the code. You graduated from the University of Lagos. You learned extra programming languages at night. You sent out hundreds of applications. One company finally said yes. You became part of the borderless workforce, the modern Nigerian dream. Your apartment has steady air conditioning, a mass when fuel is available. You own a generator because the grid fails regularly. You send money home to your parents. You plan, you save, you think long term. Then you check your banking app. The Naira has fallen again, 20% in 6 weeks. Your euro salary hasn't changed, but everything else has. Rent is being renegotiated in dollars. Imported medicine for your mother now costs 4 times what it did 18 months ago. Groceries shift in price weekly. Your savings shrink even as you earn. You open social media. One-word trends, Japa, escape. Nurses left first, then doctors, now engineers, Canada, Germany, the UK. You wonder, should I leave too? But beneath that question lies a deeper one. Why is leaving the only reliable strategy? Nigeria has been independent for over 60 years. It has earned hundreds of billions in oil revenue. It has hosted development conferences, signed trade deals, entered IMF programs, partnered with the World Bank. And yet the most rational plan for a skilled young professional is departure. This is not only Nigeria's story, it is the story of an invisible wall. For 70 years, developing nations have sprinted toward prosperity, only to collide with something they cannot see. We were told the global economy is a ladder. Climb through education, liberalize markets, attract investment, integrate into trade. Growth will follow. But what if it's not a ladder? What if it's a ceiling? Look at the numbers. In 1960, much of sub-Saharan Africa earned roughly a tenth of U.S. per capita income. 6 decades later, after reforms, privatizations, aid packages, and debt forgiveness, that ratio barely moved. Latin America liberalized aggressively in the 1980s and 1990s. Tariffs fell. State industries were sold. Capital controls were removed. The promise was convergence. Instead, relative income levels stagnated or slipped. Meanwhile, a small group in East Asia surged forward. South Korea was once poorer than many African nations. Today, it exports semiconductors and cars. Taiwan built world-leading chip manufacturing. China lifted hundreds of millions from poverty in 1 generation. A few countries broke through. Most did not. Why? The standard explanation blames internal failures. Corruption, weak institutions, bad governance, culture. Fix those and prosperity follows. But that story ignores something bigger. The global system itself. Imagine a game where the rules are written after some players have already won. Early industrializers used tariffs, subsidies, and heavy state direction. Once they became dominant, those same policies were labeled distortions. New rules were written. Trade agreements, limited protection, investment treaties protected foreign capital, currency systems centered on one dominant unit. The latecomers were told to compete immediately against giants who had grown under protection. It's like asking a startup to fight a multinational on day one without investors, patents, or scale, and calling it fairness. For the Lagos engineer, the currency crash feels local, but it is part of something structural. Every developing country needs dollars to buy oil, to import machinery, to service debt, to reassure investors. If export earnings fall or global interest rates rise, the local currency weakens. Debt burdens swell. Inflation spreads. Governments cut spending to calm markets. Growth slows. The cycle repeats. The wall does not appear in headlines. It appears in data, in migration flows, installed incomes. And this is where the video takes a shocking turn, because the wall is not accidental. It has architecture. And to understand it, we need to travel back to the moment the modern financial system was designed. Most people never hear the next part, and that's the real danger. War still rages. Representatives from 44 nations gather in a quiet town in New Hampshire to design the post-war economic order. At that conference, the foundations of today's system were laid. The institutions created there, including the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, would shape the next 70 years. The US dollar would sit at the center. From then on, participation in global trade meant access to dollars. For wealthy countries issuing the reserve currency, this was power. For developing nations, it was dependency. Here's how it plays out. A developing country wants to industrialize. It must import machinery and technology. Those are priced in dollars. Its exports, often raw materials, fluctuate wildly in price. When commodity prices drop, dollar income falls. To fill the gap, the country borrows in dollars. Now it owes a currency it cannot print. If U.S. interest rates rise, servicing that debt becomes more expensive overnight. If the dollar strengthens, the local currency weakens, making repayment even harder. In the early 1980s, when the U.S. Federal Reserve sharply increased rates to fight inflation, capital rushed into American assets. Across Latin America, debt burdens exploded, governments defaulted, economies contracted. A lost decade followed. One policy decision in Washington rippled across continents. When crises hit, countries turned to the IMF for emergency loans. Assistance came with conditions: cut public spending, privatize state assets, remove subsidies, open markets, float currencies. These reforms were presented as modernization, but the priority was debt repayment. Imagine a family already struggling with a mortgage being told to sell their tools, cut their children's meals, and open their home to competitors in order to keep paying the bank. Short-term stabilization often meant long-term fragility. Subsidies for local farmers were removed, while farmers in rich countries continued receiving support. State enterprises were sold at discounted prices to foreign investors. Domestic industries faced competition from established multinationals before they were ready. The ladder many wealthy nations once climbed, protective tariffs, state-directed credit, industrial planning, was now discouraged or prohibited. Later, the global trade regime solidified under the World Trade Organization. Tariffs fell further. Investment treaties allowed corporations to sue governments in international arbitration courts if policies threatened profits. Policy space narrowed. Then came the technology era. Advanced industries, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, aerospace, required decades of research and enormous capital. Key equipment is controlled by a handful of firms in a handful of countries. Export controls restrict access. The gap widens. Meanwhile, resource-rich countries face another trap. Oil, minerals, rare metals, these attract foreign companies with capital and expertise. Contracts are complex. Profits are often repatriated. When commodity prices fall, revenues collapse, but debt remains. This pattern played out repeatedly in places like Nigeria, Venezuela, and Angola. The resource boom strengthens the currency, making manufacturing less competitive. Other sectors wither. The economy becomes dependent on one export. When the boom ends, crisis begins. It is not magic. It is incentives. Corporations seek profit. Banks seek repayment. Governments in wealthy nations defend their strategic industries. Local elites in developing countries benefit from the arrangement. Ordinary citizens pay the cost. The garment worker earning a fraction of the final retail price. The miner exposed to toxic dust. The nurse trained at public expense who emigrates, leaving hospitals understaffed. Brain drain accelerates. Capital flows outward. Dependency deepens. For the Lagos engineer, Japa is not just a trend. It is a rational calculation within a constrained system. But here's the twist. Some countries did break through. They did not follow the script. And the next part might completely change how you see this topic. In the 1960s, South Korea was devastated by war. Income levels were lower than many African states. It had few natural resources. Yet within decades, it became a high-income industrial powerhouse. How? The government intervened heavily. It directed credit to selected industries. It protected domestic firms from foreign competition. It demanded export performance. It limited capital flows. It nurtured conglomerates until they could compete globally. This was not laissez-faire capitalism. It was strategic statecraft. Taiwan followed a similar path, investing in technology and shielding infant industries. China went further. State-owned enterprises, capital controls, forced technology transfers, massive infrastructure spending. It integrated into global trade, but on negotiated terms. Size mattered. Geopolitics mattered. Timing mattered. During the Cold War, strategic alliances created room for maneuver. In China's case, global corporations were eager to access its vast market. But not every country has that leverage. Small and mid-sized developing nations face stricter trade rules, volatile capital flows, and limited bargaining power. Breaking the rules can trigger sanctions or capital flight. So what are their options? Play by existing rules and hope for gradual improvement, attempt strategic defiance and risk retaliation, or manage dependency while minimizing damage. None are easy. The deeper truth is unsettling. The global system was designed primarily to stabilize and advantage the post-war industrial powers. It rebuilt Europe and Japan. It entrenched dollar dominance. It secured access to resources. Over time, new layers were added: trade agreements, investor protections, intellectual property regimes. The architecture evolved. The hierarchy endured. This does not mean growth is impossible. Millions have risen out of poverty. Technology spreads. Regional integration creates new opportunities. But catching up fully, closing the income gap with the richest nations, remains rare. For the Lagos engineer, the choice feels personal. Stay and navigate volatility, or leave and seek stability elsewhere. Multiply that decision by millions. That is how structural forces shape human lives. The wall is not made of concrete. It is made of contracts, currencies, institutions, and incentives. It operates quietly. It does not collapse dramatically. It simply maintains distance. And here is the final question. Was the system ever built for convergence, or was it built for stability? Stability that preserves hierarchy. History suggests patterns, but history is not finished. Power shifts. Supply chains reorganize. Digital economies create new niches. Regional blocks form. Fragmentation may open cracks in the wall, or reinforce it. What happens next depends on policy choices, political will, and global dynamics still unfolding. For now, the engineer refreshes his banking app. The numbers move. The decision looms. Stay or go. That tension between effort and outcome, between promise and structure, defines the developing world's modern experience. If you want to understand how global systems truly function, beyond slogans, beyond headlines, this is what we explore here. This is not financial advice. It is structural analysis, because once you see the architecture, you cannot unsee it. And if you want deeper investigations like this, stories that trace the invisible forces shaping nations and lives, subscribe to Economic Tales. History is still being written. The question is who it will favor next.